I have two brief questions I'd like to ask, if I may.
Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone and you're watching The Daily Question. Before I get into today's question of the day, just a couple of little things. I'm recording this episode and there's a bit of a gale blowing outside, so if you hear what sounds like a tornado, it's just the weather outside. It's a bit unusual today. And secondly, yes, I do have a bit of an eye infection, so I haven't been the victim of spousal abuse. I have an eye infection. Right, let's get on with it. Today's question of the day: was Aretha Franklin's funeral too politicised? Now, the reason I'm asking that question is because her funeral, or different aspects of her funeral actually, which I believe was almost 9 hours long, which seems quite a long amount of time for a funeral, but hey, she was a big superstar and a giant in her own right in the music industry. And what she brought to the world, her gifts and her talents and abilities. And so it's kind of understandable that people really wanted to memorialise her in a big and special kind of way. But one of the controversies that's arisen around her funeral was the sermon that was delivered by the Reverend Jasper Williams Jr. And he covered a whole lot of ground, and some of the more controversial points that have been sort of generating a bit of public attention, or particularly with the Twitterati. He talked about Black Lives Matter and sort of raised the question, why is it that as a black community, we are so impassioned? I'm obviously speaking as him now. I don't profess to be black. Why is it that we are so impassioned about Black Lives Matter issues? And when you have a police shooting of a black man, which is obviously not a good thing, but we're willing to make a big deal about that, and even to the point of rioting. However, the issue of black on black crime, which is far more serious, we just seem very silent about that. We don't seem to have that same passion and commitment to addressing that issue. He also talked about the problem of black fatherlessness, so the lack of black men who are actually present as fathers in their homes and in the lives of their children. He was very glowing in his praise of black women, but he said that basically a black mother is never going to be a substitute for a father who is not present in the home, and as I said, he was very glowing in his praise of those mothers and the sort of the beauty and the strength that they display. But the fact is that there's something wrong when a dad is not present in the home. And lastly, he also talked about things like how the civil rights movement had led to, he wasn't critical of the civil rights movement itself, but just some of the outcomes subsequent to that. And he talked about like how as a black community we sort of seem to be a bit more disintegrated, and there was a lack of black business ownership, for example, and pride and sort of unity as a community of people. Now, there was nothing that he said that I thought was particularly controversial or outrageous. In many ways, he was very reminiscent of what I imagined an Old Testament prophet might be like. The guy who wanders into town dressed in a big bear skin. His breath smells of honey and locust. He's got a whopping great stick, and he stands in the middle of your town square, and he says things that need to be said, but they're often very unpopular in the culture and the time in which they are spoken. And it sort of seems to me that he was just challenging the status quo and saying, hey, maybe we need to think about some of these other issues as well. That's certainly what I took from it. I don't profess to be black. I'm obviously not a member of the black community in the US, so maybe my read on things isn't as good as it could be, but it did seem that he was raising some pretty valid questions. One of the issues that he talked about, fatherlessness, is something that's pretty close to my heart. And I found myself agreeing with them, regardless of race. It's a very important point, whether it's a black family, a white family, or an Asian family. It doesn't matter what the ethnicity is, that the problem of fatherlessness in a home is a very, very serious problem. There's something here that is really, really not good at all, not just for the children, not just for the woman, but for your society, for your community. And it really is pressing that we address that issue. So, as I said, for me, there was nothing too controversial. However, some of my listeners who are part of the black community might disagree and say that was terrible what he said. I guess the big question for me, though, is not the substance so much of what he was saying. The big question for me was, is this appropriate at a funeral? Is this a funeral that has now been politicised? Because if so, that's not a good thing. Now, I don't know. He's obviously very close to the Franklin family. And so perhaps Aretha Franklin, this was where her heart was. And she said to him, this is what I want from you. I want one of those sermons that you deliver where you really call the black community to greatness and just don't hold anything back. And maybe she was really invested in the sort of the focus of this guy and his preaching at other events. And so she said, that's what I want at my funeral. I don't know. But if not, and this was just him deciding that he was going to go down this path because he was a very public opportunity to do that, I would say something is amiss here, and I question whether that's the right time or place to do that. Now, I'm a little bit different. I come from an Irish family, or a family with an Irish heritage, and so we weren't afraid of telling the truth when it needed to be told, and sometimes inappropriately, but I'm not saying that's necessarily the good model for everything in society, and particularly not at a very sensitive and sacred time such as a funeral. And I just wonder whether you've moved away from focusing on the actual person and memorialising and celebrating their life and into now a very, very big and much broader political piece of commentary when you move into these areas at someone's funeral. Like I said, I don't know the answer to the question because I don't know whether or not Aretha Franklin actually wanted this. I couldn't find myself majorly conflicted about his message and the content of what he was saying. I just raised questions in my own mind about whether or not a funeral is the most appropriate place to sort of present those ideas. However, in saying that, I guess others would respond by saying, well, if the truth is important enough and it's not being said, then just like that wild-eyed prophet who wanders into town at the most inappropriate time and says things, maybe this is actually the most important time because the audience is there to hear a very important message. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comments section below. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please support me on PayPal or Patreon. There's a link for both in the description below. That's right, I can hear my theme music too. I'll see you tomorrow on The Daily Question.